Welcome to Wildcat Science. This is human biology, psychology, and part 2. And we are going to be studying brain behavior today. In part 1, we did an overview of psychology and what we're going to be studying. We reviewed our nervous system, endocrine systems, the neuron, the central and peripheral nervous systems, including the somatic and autonomic parts of the central nervous system, and the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. And then we learned about neurotransmitters, which are those chemical messengers that will go between neurons, acetylcholine, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, GABA, and the group called endorphin. So let's jump a little deeper into the brain. So different parts of the brain control different aspects of your behavior. So you have your hindbrain, which helps you survive, react, and repeat. And this controls unconscious and essential functions. Part of that is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum coordinates movement, balance, and posture, and the cerebellum is what is impaired with alcohol. So movement and balance will be disrupted with alcohol. So looking at a picture of this, and you don't need to draw this, but you do need to know where the cerebellum is. You'll have some diagrams you'll need to fill in later. It is found right way in the back, tucked by the brainstem. So that involves movement, balance, and posture. Another part of your essential hindbrain is the medulla. And that has some pretty important functions. Your heart beating, breathing, and blood pressure are all regulated in the medulla. And then it's also part of the brainstem. Another part of the brainstem is called the pons, which coordinates movement, urination, regulates sleep and dreaming. And if you remember from our urinary system, the urinary control is part of the pons, which is part of the brainstem. And looking at some pictures of the brainstem, we have our brain, and then there's our brain stem. And then looking at the brain stem a little bit more up close, you have the medulla, and then you have the pons. Okay, so before moving on, let's take a minute and talk about pronunciation. So according to Cambridge Dictionary,
medulla oblongata.
Medulla oblongata is how you would say the medulla. Okay, so moving past our hindbrain, which was our cerebellum, medulla, and pons, we're moving on to the midbrain, which is a little bit more complex. It's the segment of the brainstem important for integrating sensory processes like vision and hearing and motor control. So it's all still part of the brainstem, but we're getting into sensory processing. Also some sleep-awake cycles, pain perception, and temperature regulation. You should write down the stuff that's in black, and you can write this down in purple if you so choose. And then let's talk about the forebrain, which is the largest and most complex part and contains many different parts. There is the thalamus, which takes in and processes sensory information and sends this information to the correct sensory cortex. So looking at a picture of our thalamus, it is this section right here. So the thalamus is there, and then another part of your brain is the hypothalamus, which you should have heard of before. And we also know that hypothalamus is going to be found below the thalamus. So where have we heard about this before? With the endocrine system. We know that the hypothalamus links the nervous system to the endocrine system by receiving nerve signals and then telling the pituitary gland to release hormones. For example, the hypothalamus may get a nerve signal and then it'll tell the anterior pituitary gland to release some thyroid stimulating hormone, which then tells the thyroids to release their hormones. So it's an important link between the brain, nervous system, and the endocrine system. And the hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system, so all the things that happen unconsciously, like heart beating and your blood pressure and all that good stuff. It also regulates your basic biological drives, and it is also involved in translating extreme emotions into physical freezes, like your fight response with your parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, your sympathetic autonomic nervous system, flight, same thing, or freeze. Those are all linked with the hypothalamus. Okay, let's take a look at the picture of the hypothalamus, where the hypothalamus is. You can just see it tucked under the thalamus, which is this looking, whatever looking thing there, and then the hypothalamus is below it. And it looks a lot like a bug in this drawing, but you can see there's a lot going on in the hypothalamus. Next up is the amygdala. The amygdala is involved in your emotional responses. Anytime there is fear or aggression, it's involved in the emotional response of memory consolidation, so any kind of emotional aspects of memories. So if you get a warm fuzzy when you smell cookies and that reminds you of your grandma's house, the amygdala would be involved. And also when you hear a dog bark and it reminds you of when you were 2 and that dog bit you, that would also be a response in your amygdala. It's also involved in the emotional aspect of decision making, which is a lot of the decisions that we make. So the amygdala attaches emotional significance to information and processes in our everyday life, every moment. So looking at a picture of the brain, a cross-section of the brain, we can see we have our thalamus here, and then tucked underneath there the hypothalamus in orange, and then this little bean thing in green is the amygdala. Okay, looking some more at the brain, we've already talked about the cerebellum in the hindbrain and part of the brain stems, the medulla and the pons. And we're going to be talking about, in the forebrain, everything else, the hippocampus and the cerebral cortex and many other sections. So let's talk about the hippocampus. The hippocampus should be working right now. It is central for learning and memory and the transfer of information from short-term to long-term memory. So the hippocampus is a part of the brain that is very important for learning and memory, and it's really important in transferring information from short-term to your long-term memory. So let's talk about the limbic system, which is not an actual exact part of the brain. It is a loosely connected network of brain structures that control the emotional components of behavior, memory, and motivation. So a lot of different parts of your brain are working together in the limbic system, and its emotional components of behavior, memory, and motivation. So there's a lot going on there. So what would be considered part of the limbic system? Well, the olfactory bulbs with smelling, again with grandma's cookies and that emotional connection. The hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is involved, remember, with the endocrine system and controlling our autonomic or involuntary responses. The amygdala, which we know is involved with fear responses. And interesting fact with the amygdala, if you have an overactive amygdala, that often causes disorders with anxiety or lots of worrying, or if somebody has trouble with anger, often they have an overactive amygdala, and then that's a reaction to that. And hippocampus, talking about learning and memory. And then your thalamus, which involves processing sensory information. And so you know when you remember something, often some kind of sensory information like a sound or a smell or a song or how something feels or looks will remind you of a memory, and then there's often an emotional component to that, either positive or negative. So the limbic system all works together quite well. Okay, then the last section we're going to talk about in this part is the cerebrum, which is the largest and most complex, and it's responsible for all of our complex mental activities, and it is divided into two hemispheres. So in humans, this makes up the rest of the brain, the bulk of the brain, and there's quite a bit going on in there, and we will talk about that in our next section. All right, great. See you then.